So we're inside the cabin, and this is a rare opportunity. I mean, even for me, really, to be next to Rob. I'm going to be you guys, and we're going to see what's going on in here, and Rob will be able to tell us how these synths work, because I really don't know how they work from the inside out. So, the beast.
The beast indeed, the CS-80. This is one of the synths that we are most known for working on, though unfortunately that also comes with a serious wait list, and I know Eli loves saying this, but there's, I think, 12 of these here right now, all waiting for restoration, which is a lot, because there's a lot going on inside of these, as I'll show you shortly. And that's because it is a very powerful synthesizer. And I'd love it if you could actually play it a little bit and show people what the poly aftertouch is all about, the velocity, and of course the ribbon controller. And then I can show you how it ticks, so to speak.
Yeah, and you know, partly because it's the year that it was built, right? I mean, it's like when you see the inside, you're gonna see like a lot of wires.
That's right. When we talked about this, you know, we were talking about, you know, a few synths to show the inside of, and this is kind of a good example of how synths were before the, common availability of microprocessors. So everything inside is very functional but large, which later was replaced by just a chip or 5, you know.
Not always to the better.
Not always to the better, that's right.
So what I'm already doing is just showing you like how uniquely expressive. Like if I were to ask you, what's the most expressive synthesizer?
Easily this.
Right? Because
without question.
I'm just fooling around with a ring modulator, you know, and a ring modulator, like we don't always think of it in that way, but it's really like starting with amplitude modulation. So it's like tremolo. And I'm increasing the amount of tremolo. Right? It's deeper. This is shallow tremolo. That's shallow. Here's deeper. Now I'm increasing the speed, but it allows you to get all the way up into the audio range. And then you get these sort of ring modulated type tones. Mentioning the ribbon controller just sort of picks up where you left off on the keyboard. So now if I release my finger, it'll go back. Yep. But if I did the reverse, it'll stay there.
Wow.
So there's all kinds of, you knew that.
I actually, that part didn't click in my head right when you were doing it. I was like, wait, what's he gonna do?
Well,
that makes sense though.
Okay, I was just mentioning this to Rob. I started out in 1977 performing with 6 of these, playing Beethoven symphonies, and the first piece was Beethoven's 8th.
How's your back?
That's really the question, right? I lifted them, you know.
I believe it. I remember like, when you took yours home, and I was like, "Who helped you get a card?" Like, "Oh, I just muscled it in."
And when I was at USC, I didn't have a recording set up, so we brought it up the stairs.
Wow. In
the little like brick music building, you know, like. Wasn't really wide enough and all that, but you know, it's what you do when you have a desire to make something happen. So, you know, there's presets on the instrument. There's, you know, you can hear them all quickly. Strings. Rob's making it brighter because you also have override controls here, basically.
I'm putting it in the center position so that you're getting the intended brightness of the preset.
Yeah, I had it like all the way muted.
Which is actually better for the first set of strings.
Yeah.
Because the rest it sounds a little honky.
And you can add resonance to it. Hear that little wowie sound. And then there's brass, you know, the famous. Let's get it back to the center. And octaves. So you have 2 sets, a left and a right. So we can get, and these are kind of related to like a pipe organ.
That's right.
Right? So 16 foot means below, an octave below, and then 8 foot is sort of your standard tuning, I guess. So you have, this is just the one side, so A440, and then if I bring in the octave, let's go back to that. I'll bring in the octave. So now you have 2 octaves, and you have 2 sides, and then these tunings are related to octaves, fifths, and thirds, just like organs.
Yeah.
It goes all the way up. So you can solo one side, here's a flute sound. And it has expression like we were talking about. if I wanted to bring in like something underneath it, like a clavichord. Let me bring it to the same frequency. Now you have a...
Some might be wondering what the usefulness is of having the really high footings on here. And actually a trick that our friend Steve Picaro showed me is that the organ presets are supposed to make use of that by having them like that. And then if you play it like an organ, you get that.
Brighter maybe. Now I have to get... Let's try with some more chorusing, maybe? I guess so. So that's the best organ, huh? There's like
I think it's almost supposed to be like a home organ if this is done like that.
I think so.
Yeah, like that.
Not really a pipe organ,
yeah.
right?
No, not at all. An organ like that. But if you have these all on the same footing, it's a lot less convincing as an organ.
Right, that makes sense.
And then you get that organ percussive harmonic structure.
With some other CS-80 type effects.
Yes.
And then you can go up to the panel, and then you can kind of create your own sounds on the CS-80.
That's right. And it's funny because when you're in a preset, the first thing people reach for is the sliders, which will do nothing unless you're in the panel mode right there.
Right.
Actually, there's memories as well, which aren't really memories either because you have to program those over here. So if you like what you've made here, you have to make it again over there to recall it.
With these little switchies, you know, and they are basically a recreation of what Yamaha did when they made organs in the early, I guess late 60s, early 70s. They allowed you to create presets with little switches like this. And it was an extension of their organ technology. The YC meant Yamaha combo organ. And then when they made synthesizers, what does CS stand for?
I've heard two versions. It's either combo synthesizer or compact synthesizer. The latter being very funny.
Because it weighs, what, 200 plus pounds?
Yeah, and the combo, kind of makes sense when you think about this being very organ-like. There's also combo organs, but I think they did mean compact because there's a lot of CS synthesizers, none, and this is the only one that is a backbreaker. The other ones are much more manageable.
Yeah. That's for sure. All right, well, I mean, I really want to know what's going on underneath this thing.
Sure. So let's shut it off for safety, and then unplug it for safety, and then I will show you the inside. One thing I find very funny about old synthesizers is how easy they are to open compared to newer things, which may have as many as 75 screws just to get the bottom off. CS-80 only requires 2 to 3, depending on the era. And then you can lift it up.
2 to 3 screws to get the lid off.
And get right inside the unit. We are inside the beast. So as you may see, there is miles and miles of wire in this thing. The people out there who know what they're looking at will see some extra stuff. This does have MIDI, which we'll show later on once we get really under the hood. But everything in the CS-80, audio-wise and otherwise, is all held in what's called the rack. And that's this rack of cards over here, which lifts up.
Whoa.
Very hilariously, which gives you access to unscrew cards and very carefully remove them from the rack and service them. One funny thing about it is that the bottom one here is actually charged with voltage. So if it touches here, it'll actually cause problems. So you have to insulate the keyboard from the cards or else big problems. So we have 16 what's called M boards for master board over here. So that's starting right here to here. A couple cards, I think those are the R boards, and then 8 more master cards for the second layer because the CS-80 is bitimbral at all times with 1 oscillator.
So that's timbre. 2 sounds at once.
2 sounds at once all the time. So you don't have a 16 voice option. It's always just 8 voices with 2 synthesizer layers going at any time.
Unless you put the mod in for, right, unison mode.
Oh yeah, well the unison still will just trigger all 16 cards at once. And then you can choose whether it's 8 or 8.
But do you get 2 sounds at once in unison mode?
Definitely.
Oh.
Yeah. still the same thing, just unison. One key triggers all 8 possible voices.
Yeah.
And then under the keyboard, there's even more, and that's where you get into the interesting thing about this compared to later synthesizers, which have microprocessors, is that there's a whole other world of things right under the keyboard. And they give you this nice kickstand right here.
I've never seen you do this. I've never seen under here.
Yeah, so here we have basically a whole bunch of CMOS chips around that help manage the keyboard velocity and aftertouch so that it can route it to the appropriate voice, so that when you hit a C, it knows that the pressure for that's only going to voice 3 or whatever voice that C is triggering at that moment. This is all from the MIDI, so it's wouldn't be there in a normal CS-80. Noises. There's always noises today. And over here you have 2 custom chips in the CS-80 that Yamaha made. One's a DAC and the other is a key code generator or assigner, and that is just part of Yamaha's proprietary way of putting a keyboard like this into a unit like this and having it bust the CVs and gates where they need to go. But it's a pretty amazing design. Everything in here would be managed by software very soon after. I guess if this was 77, it only took a year and a half or 2 before Dave Smith basically replaced all of this junk with a Z80.
Oh, that's why the Prophet 5 took off. And
that's right, because you can only imagine what it would take to build one of these, let alone a few thousands of these.
How many people did it take to build one of these?
I have no idea, but I can only guess that they had an assembly line of many, many people building these.
And each person did a task.
Yeah, I assume one person would probably run the looms of wires, one person would pre-tin them, one person stuffs the board, and they're all wave soldered. But yeah, it's a pretty amazing design, all things considered, that it can do all the dynamic things that it does without any software intervention whatsoever.
Now, do you have to, when you're fixing it, actually trace it down to just one of these colored wires and find
Oh yeah,
out?
absolutely. The service manual for these actually states the different, like when in the schematic it'll say like GY and you know that's green, but then there's also 2 kinds of blue, I believe. There's like sky blue and earth blue.
And any one of those could be the one that's causing the problem?
If it's a broken wire, sure, but what's more likely is that the part of the circuit that it's connected to has failed, and then you have to go through that and fix it. So if there's a problem with aftertouch assignment, say one voice doesn't have aftertouch, it's probably on this board. If one voice is missing a velocity, it's probably a broken wire on this board.
Okay, so what are the boards? What's that board?
So these are the TSB boards. These are identical boards. One handles half the keyboard, one handles the other half. And then this is the, I believe, the TKC board. And this handles the touch control and, again, routing the keyboard signals to the appropriate voices. This is the KAS board, which generates the control voltages and also deals, I think, a little bit with the ribbon as well and all the triggers for the voices. And this is the sample and hold module, which takes those voltages and then actually sends these to the cards and holds the voltage so that the voltage doesn't droop. That's some terminology you might, when you hear sample and hold, you might think of like an ARP 2600 random voltage generator. And that's not what a true sample and hold is, which is taking a voltage that's inputted in for a short period of time and then holding it. And yeah, then you have your cage right here for the power and big old power supply over here. And there's a lot, this is kind of the first area that we rebuild when we start on a CS-80. This is area number 1.
But in the end, these boards they're sending out voltage, right? Isn't that what the bottom line is for a synthesizer?
Yes, these are sending out zeros and ones basically, depending on the key that you're pressing, and these are actually generating control voltages.
Literal voltages. So there is like some kind of computer thing going on here when you say zeros and ones. That's
No, it's binary logic.
That's analog then.
Yeah. Well, yes, in that there's no code for it, but it is very much, just binary, which I guess is still digital.
It seems like it to me. But it's right in that period, I think, where we're just emerging from analog into like the digital age, and they were
exactly
using chips, I guess, as opposed to just like blowing air into tubes. Exactly.
Like how much smaller would an ARP sequencer be if it had a microprocessor? But something like this, it knows you're holding down this note and then you held down another one, and it knows what to do with that information to bust those things to the right voices. And it's very impressive. Very, very impressive. And I guess also kind of ahead of its time and kind of one of a kind as well. Not a lot does it like that.
And all these things have to do with the sound of it, right? Even the instability of it is what we call warmth or something like that, right?
Yeah, down there would be more the dynamic abilities of it are all held down there. That all interfaces with these key switches in the back, which depending on the timing between these two springs or two contacts back here will determine the velocity. And then if you look through here, you may be able to actually see the little black pads that are for each polyphonic aftertouch. There's a sensor
Where's
under
the black
each
pad?
key. You'd have to really get your head in there to look. But there is each key hits a small black pad, and
then
those
you
are all
push
busted.
into the pad?
Yes. And then those are all coming out on wires, which you'll see.
And what are
right
the
here.
pads getting? They send out numbers or something? Or
Those are sending out analog voltages.
analog voltage?
Yeah, those are that is analog.
So it's just the harder you push it, the more it screams out a voltage.
That's right. That's exactly what it
That's
does.
just hard for me to really
Yeah.
understand. It's a
Yeah.
pad, though. How
Yeah.
does the pad know that it does voltage?
Conductive rubber, doped rubber.
So it's something that they buy, like pads that when you put pressure on them, they release voltage. Is that it?
No, so it's a circuit. So it'd be like a series of basically gold prongs, and then there's a piece of conductive, and there's two voltages on there. And then there's a doped pad on top, and then when you press that down, it's varying the resistance between those 2 points, and then that is then just an analog voltage, 0 to 5 volts, 0 to 7 volts. I think that's what it actually is, and then that all gets bussed into what's called a demultiplexer, and then that multiplexes that signal to the various places it needs to go.
Just so many. It's like the complexity of the human body just walking. Like
Yeah.
if you had to think about everything, bend your knee, flex your ankle, land your heel, move your foot forward, but at the same time, keep your head up, move your arms, all of the things that go into proprioception, like the act of moving, that's kind of going on here. It's like a mini thing that's performing the sound. And then when you have to know all those things, how they convert into wires and boards.
Yes, and that's kind of the thing about synth repair that makes it not so easy to get into, is really understanding how all that works, how it goes from pad to multiplexion. I don't know if that's even a word, but I assume it is. And getting that into all the places it needs to go, because velocity doesn't just need to go to the filter. It's got to go to the amp. It's got to go to the pitch bend.
Right.
It's got to go to all kinds of places that you want it to go in on 2 different layers. And in order to do that, they have all these other support boards here that can take those voltages and actually separate them from 1 voltage. So eventually the aftertouch and the velocity are 1 voltage. And what happens is that one of the boards just takes like the first 3 milliseconds of the voltage. And this is all analog. There's no software. They do this with capacitors and transistors. And it knows just the first voltage, and that's the velocity. And then any voltage after that sends through a gate that's only open for a certain period of time for the aftertouch, or rather for the velocity.
So they're all
stays
acting.
open.
They're all acting and acting upon each other, right? Responding to each other. And they're all heat sensitive.
They're all heat sensitive, and they require calibration for every voice and every aftertouch right here. It's a ton to know.
Are these all dedicated for a function, each one of these little
That's right.
vertical guys?
That is right.
So just, can you
let's
just
see
go?
if I can take one out. So let's see which one might be interesting to take out. So these KBC boards, these first ones here, and then let me bend this up, see how hard it is to get out while we're on camera where nothing goes right.
Now, who's going to do this to their C8? I don't think you would recommend anyone do this.
Right. So, so this board, I'm not sure if this is for brilliance or volume, but essentially the CS-80 and the 60 have keyboard tracking for the filter or the amplitude. And in order to have both and be separate, they have 2 of these boards. So this board and this next board are completely identical. And they have this DAC chip right here that respond to these sliders and make it so that you can make the keyboard respond differently on the bottom for just filter or just amplitude, either on the top or the bottom. And yeah, so that's just one dedicated function, one entire board just for that, for half that function really, another identical board, and then even more. So then we had the TWS, which is, I believe that's the board I was just talking about, where it separates the aftertouch and velocity.
Did you turn the power off?
Yeah, it's unplugged and everything, so we're totally safe here. Yeah, so this is the TWS.
Looks totally different.
Totally different. Yeah, so this is the board. They have a series of transistors, and again, when it receives a gate, it opens one, voltage gate for just a few milliseconds, and then keeps another gate open after that for the aftertouch. Very complex, very hard to do that in an analog realm without any software or anything. It's pretty amazing. Actually, this is one of the main problems with this CS-80 when I first got it. So this card's completely rebuilt with all these new caps and everything. But yeah, it's a pretty amazing thing. Lots going on. And I'll show you an M board while we're here.
I mean, this board is an industrial park with warehouses here and then trees, and there's a little park here.
Yeah, they're pretty beautiful.
And then this one is an oil refinery with the tanks.
Yep.
And smokestacks.
And then here's your actual, here's where the actual magic happens here.
Another completely different looking board.
Completely different looking board. So here you have the ranked oscillator. So this is a, when you change the oscillator chip in most CS-80s, they need to have that exact number or one very close to it. So this one's rank 41. So if I have a dead oscillator, I better find one that's pretty close to that, or else it'll drift out of tune differently than the other voices. You have the wave shaper chip here, which converts the saw wave to all the different waveforms it has, including the sine wave. Then you have two filter chips. So one's for high pass, one's for low pass in series. Then two envelope generators here. Then all your calibrations here, all your VCAs here, and even more calibration here for the filter and the envelopes. Very complex.
This has like these purple guys on it that I don't see on the other ones.
Yeah. Actually, these caps should normally be changed, but
Caps means capacitors?
Capacitors, yeah. But as they say about the cobbler's shoes, I don't have the time to change them in my own instruments, but in a customer's instruments, we'd never leave these lilac capacitors in there. They do leak all the time. So these ones are good.
So those are like old, they're original then?
Yeah, these are all original, for better and for worse. But the CS-80's been fairly reliable.
And look at all the soldering that's going on under there, right? Is that where they attach it, all that?
Mm-hmm. And then it's all hardwired with these wires. It's a pretty amazing design. This is one whole synth voice.
And this card is like, it's a card with holes in it, and they have to put all these things on there and then solder it and make it all work?
Yep.
And then test the board, and then put it in and test it to see if it works with the board that it's supposed to work with, and then the next board that it's supposed to work with. And I mean, it's way beyond the level of complexity that it seems like humanly worth the endeavor.
What's funny to me about the 80 compared to the smaller ones, the 16 to 50, is that these filter chips actually get really hot, and because the oscillator chip's right above it, it's part of what causes the tuning instability in these, is these chips get hotter than this one. But in the 60, the cards are actually held diagonally. So the heat from those just goes up into the air and doesn't affect the oscillator as much as
Was that built later, the 60?
Those actually predate the 80.
Oh, but had a better design then. But they couldn't fit it, that's all.
Yeah, there's no way they could have fit it. The thing would have to be another half a foot longer at least, or deeper.
That's the oscillator? But so how does that make a sound? It just looks like a chip.
Well, all chips are really just a series of transistors that need support circuitry. So, here's a polystyrene capacitor that kind of gives the timing to the chip to keep it stable. Polystyrene capacitor is a very stable capacitor. There's a diode that's actually under the chip that sort of senses the heat to help compensate for temperature differences. And then a various amount of other things here, including a FET transistor right there that support the oscillator to function off of this chip. And then this chip itself is the wave shaper. So this just produces a saw wave. This produces the sine wave and the pulse wave.
From the sawtooth?
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So the sawtooth has every frequency that's going to be needed for the other waveforms?
Yeah, it's the core of the oscillator. And actually most discrete oscillators and most discrete synthesizers are saw cores.
Oh.
So they start with a saw wave and then it goes to, and then they wave
that's
shape.
all the frequencies in the overtone series decaying linearly. So out of that, you could pretty much recreate a square wave because you would just skip overtones, and you would have it more an exponential decay, right? So then I guess then you could do it. In the sine wave, you just get rid of everybody else, and you only have the fundamental. I didn't know that. But then I still don't understand, like, gets a bit ignorant, but how does this make a sound? Like, if I blow into a tube, I understand how it makes a sound. So you've talked about capacitors and all these things. Like, how do you get this thing to scream and make an audio sound?
To make an audio sound, all it requires is voltage, and that's the old thing with Bob Moog making the voltage-controlled synthesizer and the voltage-controlled function block. All these things are just controlled by voltage. And
so you get it alternating enough, and then it's a frequency.
That's right. So this circuit here, basically just creates a saw wave, and then you have to input voltage to change the frequency of that saw wave, and then you have trimmers here to compensate for the various octaves and to make sure it tracks the keyboard properly, and then the gates fire off the envelopes, which have their own set of support.
And they're
circuitry.
here too, the envelopes?
Yeah, these are the envelope chips right here. So those receive voltages from the sliders up here, or the preset cards, which are in here somewhere. And once you fire it off with a gate, it just goes through that envelope cycle, and that affects the filters directly or the oscillator if needed. And really whatever, and here's all your VCAs here. So this, I believe, is the VCA envelope, and that will just trigger one of these VCAs.
And depending on the type of chip, it's going to have a characteristic sound in the end, right?
That's right, and they're from part to part, they're not perfect either, so they all need to be calibrated. And in a CS-80 especially, it's very touchy to calibrate the envelopes.
To match the personalities of the chips.
Yeah, or to match from voice to voice more than anything.
That's what I mean, from voice to voice.
Yeah, matching them from voice to voice is very difficult, hardly ever perfect, but we like it that way. That's part of what gives these the vibe.
Yeah, like a different player on each note, basically.
Yeah. One might ring out just a little bit longer than the other. One decay might be just a little bit longer, and that changes over the time that it's on. The sound that you make when you first turn it on, or even an hour later, maybe slightly different 10 minutes after that, and that's cool.
And that's where the digital oscillators and where everything's digital, and like you just kind of lose that.
You definitely lose that. So I wanted to show you a bit more about like the output stage and the effects. So like on this board, we have this MN3001 BBD, and that'll facilitate the chorus function on this. But again, just kind of goes to show what's involved just to get one little function. Nowadays they do that just on the DSP.
That's for chorus? That entire board?
This entire board is for the effects, that's right.
Wow.
So you got these Yamaha VCAs here, and then the BBD, and I believe this is how they would do the tremolo. Here's the actual output board. It's called the PRA board. Normally this would have an insulating sheet over it, but this one does not have that at the moment. And here's also where the ring modulator is, and that's right here on this chip. So, and then you might know the ring modulator has a envelope for it, and that's right here. And all these things work together to make one of the best sounding ring modulators in any synthesizer.
Most expressive.
Yeah.
And if can it work without one of those chips? Like can the envelope, if that's not working, will the board work, or does everything have to pass through?
So it will work without this and probably whatever's the VCA or like the depth. So when you move the depth slider, that's just controlling a VCA that's taking the output from this. So that's probably right here. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's probably this chip right here. And so yeah, without these two, you'd still get a ring modulator without an envelope. Which is still a great ring modulator. But yeah, you have this is the oscillator for the ring modulator right here, and then here's the actual differential function right there. So pretty amazing what it takes just to make one synthesizer.
Yeah, I mean we're still looking at we've looked at the bottom stuff, and
we
now
barely scratched the surface.
Yeah,
really.
Because there's a lot more going on here.
There's a ton. I mean, there's boards that are just arrays of transistors, diodes, and resistors that make up the presets. So like all the sliders you see on the other side, there's boards that have basically those sliders resistance values just on normal resistors, and they switch with all these transistors to make the presets. It's really incredible.
Okay, so a quick aside, like Deckard's Dream.
Okay.
Does that have any of this in it? And then there's always like the the Arturia CS-80.
Of course.
So that's going to have none of this in it. Is the Deckard's Dream kind of in the middle? Does it have any wires and boards in there?
Well, of course, there's boards and wires, and it is analog, though I believe the envelopes and all those are software, which does make the most sense when you're making a modern product. You know, the more hardware you have, the more expensive it gets. But, you know, they use 3340 oscillators, which is the same oscillators that you'll find in like an OB8 or a Prophet 5. And then they have a wave shaping circuit that is not the same wave shaper that you see in here. It's just kind of like inspired by that. And filters that are, of course, also just inspired by these filters, because you cannot get these.
So they didn't
anymore.
really build it like this?
No.
Not even close?
Not even close.
What if I said, okay, let's together, we're going to just pool all of our money and money we don't even have, and like, can we build one of these or our own dream synthesizer with today's mindset, but like that's built like this? Is that doable?
Yesn't. So yes, yeah, that's that word means yes and no, not quite. So yes, in the sense you can build your dream synthesizer with this type of circuitry, you know, real, you know, analog hardware. You can absolutely do it. You know, if any of the big electronic stores are still around, you could go there when they're well stocked and come out with enough to build a real synthesizer just like this. The reason you couldn't build an exact CS-80 is because a lot of these chips, like the ranked oscillators, the filters, the envelopes, all of that stuff is custom chips, what's called an ASIC from Yamaha. And that ASIC means application specific integrated circuit. So those chips were produced by and for Yamaha for their series of synthesizers like this one and the 60 to 50, the 40, you name it.
Yeah.
And these white chips, these are what's called LSI, large scale integration, which is just a lot of transistors in one package. And they had all that stuff made for them. And because those are not made anymore, you cannot make one of these unless somebody remakes it, remakes the exact die that's inside the chip, and then remade the chips. And then you could definitely make your own CS-80.
So CS-80, but because
And I'm going to stop you real quick. That could happen because that's already happened to some of these synthesizers. Some of these synths, you can get every chip now. It's really amazing, and my hat's off to all the people remaking the stuff, including like Alpha in Latvia. But go ahead and continue.
Well, I was thinking that because the CS-80 is already kind of done for you as a starting point, then a lot of the expense is, you know, already out of the way, and you can fix it and keep it alive. But if you were to do this from the outset and you had to hand wire all this stuff, then it would cost way more than even
just in labor alone.
Even like, you think a CS-80 is expensive, but if you're buying it with all the work done, like if you had to pay to get this work done from scratch, what is it like? Would it be like $100,000?
It would definitely be more than 50,000. If it was built one to one, just like this, you found all the chips on eBay, but you had to make all the boards.
I buy it all for you and put it on a table, and then I come back in a year.
Oh, it'd be more than a year, and it would definitely be a lot of money.
So that's the level. That's why when we see these things going for these, you know, $50,000 or $60,000 and whatever this is going for now, I don't know, $70,000, $80,000, right? You're still not even at how much it would cost if you had to build this thing now.
That's true, and not only that, but you're also sometimes not even quite to the original price when you factor in inflation.
Well, if you compare it to the original,
what is it,
$8,000 or something?
Yeah, if they were $8,000 in 1977.
Oh, yeah.
Today, that's basically
You're still getting a deal. I mean, you know, when they were first on the market 10 years ago for $5,500, I mean, that was like a steal.
Yeah.
In a lot of ways. Okay, but then now when you have to fix it and somebody walks in and says, it's broken, it doesn't do something. I mean, how do you know where to look? What do you...
So, you know, us as specialists in what we do, we basically take what the customer says about the problems with it, and it goes in right here and goes right out here, because I know what it's supposed to sound like. I know what it's supposed to do.
So you run it through the full
I go
test.
through my own process. You know, we always start with the power supply. Is the power supply dead? Yes. Then is it dead because the power supply is dead, or is it dead because something in the synth is dragging it down? And that's always a big variable. So because we have so much experience with this stuff, we know we just start with the power supply, and then we rebuild everything that's below the keyboard, because we know that that's where most of the failures are going to be. And then if it turns on after that and then it's making sound and it's more or less working, then we can call the customer and say, okay, what was your complaint before it just stopped working completely?
I can easily understand that if you just fixed the acute thing that they were saying is the problem, there could be so many underlying problems and then it's just going to come back.
Yeah.
So you have to go from like, a holistic, if you were a doctor, you don't just like bandage up something that there's like an infection underneath.
That's right. Yeah, well, yeah, that's actually a perfect example because we would call that Band-Aid fixes if we were to do it the other way. It's like, okay, you have one voice is out of tune,
right.
let's tune one voice. It doesn't work that way.
There could be so much festering underneath with some of this.
And why is the voice out of tune? Unless someone went in there and turned the trimmer, the voice shouldn't be that far out. So it's always deeper than people assume. Statistically and humorously, the more they say it's going to be simple, usually the harder it ends up being. But yeah, did we have our own approach to just kind of starting there, go here, and then take a very holistic approach as to what the real problems are and fix every single one of them, and then find all the problems that the customer may not have even noticed. And that sounds not great as the customer. It's like, great, they're going to find a bunch of problems, but I think you'd rather it sound right than sound wrong just to save a dollar.
Well, like any doctor.
Yeah. You say, hey, by the way,
leave with more problems.
Your whole second layer is half an octave out, and a lot of other techs say just tune the tuning knob a little bit. We don't do that. We want it to be perfect.
Now,
as perfect as can be.
All this stuff now, because these are knobs and sliders. Are they sending information back the other direction? Because when I move a knob or a slider, right, then these cards and circuits need to read that.
That's right. So, the sliders are connected to the R boards, and the TR boards, I believe, as well. And those, you just parse that 0 to +7, I believe it is, to these boards. And then the board converts those voltages into what it needs. And because, you only have 2 synth engines inside of this, one wire from one slider may be bussed across, or will definitely be bussed across all 8 voices. So you see how this set of yellow wires, there's 2. That's because one of them is also going here. But they, instead of just going from here to here, they have to go through the whole rack. So a lot of dental floss.
How did you figure this out?
Well, it's really not that hard to figure out because it's actually really not that hard as long as you know the signal flow of everything. As long as you know, if the velocity works on the filter but not the amp, then you know that your problem is before or after the filter, and then you can go through the schematics and kind of figure out where the signal is supposed to go.
Okay, sure, but I mean, you're essentially from what I understand, mostly self-taught.
Completely self-taught.
Completely self-taught.
Yeah.
And self-taught, how? How'd you teach yourself?
Just doing it. It's that simple.
We didn't start with a CS-80.
Definitely did not start with a CS-80. I started with a Korg Triton. Which is wildly different than this, so it requires a lot more screws to open.
But you found similarities, right? Or how did it transition?
It transitioned into just people calling me for analog synth repair, and me kind of figuring out that fixing analog synths is actually way more possible and gratifying than fixing digital synthesizers, because you instead of just replacing a whole board, you can just say, hey, this one envelope doesn't work on this one key on this combo organ, and you can just change that one capacitor and it'll work again for a little while. That voice will work forever, but then you're like, wait, should I replace the other 49 of them for the rest of the keys? And then back then maybe no, but nowadays we're going to do all of it.
And is it all up here, or did you write down your observations?
It's all up here. I unfortunately do not keep very good notes. It's just all lives up here.
And you've passed it on to some degree to your great staff here.
Every day.
And they're just absorbing.
Yes, and that's part of the challenge is them absorbing it, keeping it, and being able to use that knowledge to figure out other issues. And that's really the sign of a great tech, is whether they can take the anecdote that you've given them about why the problem may be happening, and then have them run with that. And people always ask me, like, where do you find people? And it's like, we make them. Being a good tech is not something that people are knocking on the door saying, hey, I'm a great tech, I can work on a CS-80. That has never happened. People come here and then they work up from the Junos to this, hopefully one day.
Like someone like has to figure out how to get through a forest without a map. Like you have to teach them how to make decisions along the way, right? You can say like, well, you do this, and then there's likely to be water when there's north-facing moss and all these things. But when it comes down to it, when you're stuck in a scenario where those things don't exhibit themselves, you've got to be able to make decisions.
That's right.
Otherwise, you'd be looking at this thing and nothing's happening for weeks.
But you also need to be able to know when to take a step back and know when you need to really think about what the right decision is, because you are working on priceless things.
Yeah.
You know, and that's kind of the great thing and the horrible thing about our business is that we take that opportunity to think. You know, if we're throwing our head against a wall, we're saying, you know, I'm going to take a step back from this for a week.
And that's why it takes time.
That's why it takes time. A lot of other techs will say, shit, I got to pay the rent. I got to get this thing out the door no matter what, even if that means shotgunning the whole thing and changing every chip and every capacitor, which at the end of the day, you'll end up causing more problems usually. We'll take the time and just really try to figure it out. Hope you're enjoying learning about all this synth stuff. Please like and subscribe to my very good friend's channel here because you're very lucky to get to learn all this from such a gangster.